It was the dry season of 2025, and the ground of Burkina Faso lay fractured like forgotten pottery, scorched by years of hunger and despair. Across the Sahel, villagers had learned to fear the sky, warplanes, drones, clouds that promised rain but delivered none. Yet on one extraordinary morning, the heavens broke their silence in a way no one could have imagined. Military helicopters thundered overhead, not to sow fear, but to sow life. From their bays fell not bullets, but 2,000 metric tons of golden maize seed, cascading like sacred rain upon the cracked earth. This was not the work of the United Nations, nor the charity of foreign NGOs. It was the bold command of President Ibrahim Traoré, a man known for revolution, now rewriting the meaning of reform. In that instant, war machines became farming tools, and fear itself was transformed into a promise of survival. But bold visions never arrive without resistance. Was this the dawn of a sovereign rebirth, or a desperate gamble wrapped in poetry? Could a single harvest alter the destiny of a continent? Stay with us. This is not just about food, but about freedom. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that chooses dignity over dependence. The story begins in Ouagadougou, inside a dimly lit war room where generals once plotted battles. In the heat of a suffocating dry season, President Ibrahim Traoré stood bareheaded before his commanders and issued an order that many thought absurd. "Fill the helicopters," he commanded. "Not with weapons, not with troops. Fill them with corn." His words fell like thunder in the silent chamber. Some officers exchanged nervous glances, others whispered doubts, but within hours the command became reality. Across military bases, sacks of maize kernels replaced crates of ammunition. Pilots, trained to fly low in combat formations, now prepared for a different mission. By dawn, fleets of military and civilian aircraft rose into the pale Sahel sky, their rotors slicing through the dust. And then, over the barren farmlands of Burkina Faso, the bays opened. Golden waves of maize tumbled into the air, scattering across thousands of acres of cracked soil, holding baskets to catch the kernels as if they were not just food falling from the sky. Old men stood still, the possibility streaming down their weathered faces. Women dropped to their knees in prayer, ululating as the golden rain coated their fields. Farmers who had endured years of despair watched in reverent silence. For once, the sky did not deliver drones or hunger, it delivered hope. The Ministry of Agriculture soon released figures that astonished even its own experts. Satellite imagery revealed green shoots sprouting in fields long written off as dead. Germination rates were nearly 40% higher than expected in arid regions once declared unsalvageable. Entire families that had survived on thin millet porridge now roasted fresh corn over open flames. Health clinics began to notice a change: fewer cases of anemia, fewer children showing signs of stunted growth. The psychological impact was just as profound as the physical one. For decades, salvation in Burkina Faso had come stamped with foreign flags, aid trucks, imported grain, handouts that fed stomachs but starved dignity. Now, for the first time in the living memory, the people received something not from donors, but from their own soil, their own government, their own sky. Songs about helicopters began to play on village radios. Children sketched them in classrooms, not as weapons of fear, but as messengers of life. What had begun as a logistical operation had become something spiritual. In one village, drums echoed through the valleys as locals composed chants in praise of the rain of seeds. Elders declared the week sacred, calling it the time when the earth was blessed from above. The moment was etched into memory, not as a line in a government report, but as lived history. Yet even as the maize shoots rose, questions lingered. Agricultural specialists voiced concerns. What if the rains failed again next year? What if pests descended on the fragile crops? Could airdropping seed, chaotic and uncontrolled, sustain long-term planning? But for the villagers, those questions could wait. An elderly farmer, his back bent from decades of toil, put it simply in a radio interview. Even if only half grows, it will feed more than any speech ever did. For a country long buried in famine reports, this was more than food security. It was proof that renewal was possible. The world had defined Burkina Faso through hunger, instability, and dependency. In a single season, that image began to crack. From the skies fell not just maize, but a message. Sovereignty can be planted, and hope can germinate even in the driest soil. But as word spread beyond the villages, so too did whispers in foreign capitals. Some celebrated a miracle. Others feared a precedent. Because when helicopters sowed seeds instead of bullets, the balance of power itself began to shift. And with every seed of hope that touched the soil, seeds of resistance were already being sown abroad. Weeks after the final helicopters emptied their bays, another transformation unfolded, one no strategist could have planned. Clouds gathered over the Sahel, darkening skies that had long withheld mercy. Then came the rain, soft at first, then steady, soaking fields where maize kernels lay hidden beneath the dust. In village after village, children raced barefoot through the mud, shouting with joy as shoots of green pierced the earth. From above, satellites recorded strange emerald lines carved across the desert. From below, they were more than anomalies. They were signs that the land was alive again. The nation erupted in celebration. Farmers who had long abandoned their plots returned, hoe in hand, to tend the new life. Women lit fires and roasted fresh maize, feeding children who had known only hunger. Local radio stations played new songs about helicopters that rained food instead of fear. In dusty courtyards, drums echoed through the night. Elders declared the season a divine blessing, a sacred turning point in the nation's story. In that atmosphere of joy, President Ibrahim Traoré traveled to Bobo Dioulasso, where tens of thousands gathered in the streets. Standing before a sea of supporters, he thundered words that carried far beyond the crowd. They called it madness when we reclaimed our gold mines. They called it danger when we sowed our own soil. Now they call it a threat because we feed our children without their stamp of approval. The crowd roared, ululating and chanting his name, as the speech was broadcast across villages and towns. But where the people saw deliverance, the outside world saw disruption. In Brussels, trade officials issued memoranda warning that Burkina Faso's maize lacked proper certification and could distort regional markets. European grain lobbies, long used to dominating West African imports, grew nervous. Leaked emails revealed their alarm. We cannot let this become a precedent. Suddenly, the fields of Burkina Faso were not just agricultural, they were geopolitical. The headlines shifted. Western newspapers ran stories questioning the sustainability of the maize revolution. Prominent economists dismissed the effort as agricultural populism. Environmental NGOs raised alarms about soil exhaustion and monoculture risks. One British analyst, writing smugly, declared, "A helicopter may scatter seeds, but it cannot scatter stability." Yet within Burkina Faso, such words rang hollow. Local journalists fired back. When Europe plants endless wheat, it is called efficiency. When Africa plants corn, it is called chaos. Across the country, ownership became the true harvest. Farmers formed cooperatives, women organized processing groups, and youth patrolled fields to protect them from theft and erosion. Internationally, however, the momentum was undeniable. Saudi Arabia and the UAE signed long-term grain contracts, hungry for reliable food supplies. India and China expressed interest not just in raw maize, but in ethanol and value-added products. Trade deals multiplied even as European barriers mounted. Meanwhile, the story dominated global media. On social platforms, clips of helicopters dropping golden showers of seed went viral. Newspapers carried the headline, "From famine to feast, a nation turns war machines into farming tools." The phrase, "rain made of seeds," became a global metaphor for renewal. Analysts, activists, and officials debated endlessly, but for the ordinary people of Burkina Faso, the truth was simpler. For the first time in years, children went to bed full. And so the movement reached its emotional zenith, a mix of euphoria at home and unease abroad. Within villages, the maize revolution was sung as a hymn of pride. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, in the corridors of power, it was whispered as a threat. This tension was captured by one international headline that became part of the Ibrahim Traoré news cycle. Is this Africa's miracle or its gamble of the century? But as the world debated, one truth became clear. If food could be power, then Burkina Faso had just rewritten the rules of the game, and powerful forces were preparing their reply. The corn revolution did not remain confined to fields and silos. It seeped into the fabric of society itself. Within months, the impact could be felt in homes, classrooms, clinics, and even in the halls of parliament. For generations, women had stood in line for foreign rations, their dignity reduced to waiting for aid stamped with foreign flags. Now, those same women were becoming investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders of cooperatives built around maize. By 2028, government data showed that more than 70% of processing cooperatives were led by women. In the northern province of Yatenga, a group of 50 women pooled their profits from selling roasted maize to purchase a small oil press. They branded their bottled product Sahel Sun, selling not only in local markets but across borders. With their earnings, they hired teachers, financed a village school, and installed solar lighting in homes. In other regions, women's cooperatives built wells, funded health posts, and employed young people to manage logistics. Dignity was no longer a slogan. It was bottled, sold, and reinvested. The ripple effects were unmistakable. Clinics reported a drop in maternal mortality, fueled by better nutrition and access to care. Children who once came to class hungry and listless now arrived with full stomachs and bright eyes. School attendance among girls surged as mothers could finally afford uniforms and fees. In one rural district, literacy among adolescent girls jumped from 45% to nearly 70% in just 5 years. The youth, too, began rewriting their futures. For decades, young men had looked northward, dreaming of crossing the Mediterranean in search of work. Now, many chose to stay. In a village near the Ghanaian border, a young man named Issa abandoned his plan to migrate and instead joined a cooperative milling maize into flour. Within 2 years, he managed a team of 15 workers, producing branded cornmeal sold in regional markets. "I used to dream of Europe," Issa said proudly in an interview. "Now I dream of building a factory here." His words echoed a broader shift. Thousands of youths who once saw agriculture as a prison now saw it as a pathway to prosperity. The government, long regarded with skepticism, began to earn credibility. Ministers visited cooperatives not to dictate, but to listen. Town halls were held to discuss price floors and seed grants. In Parliament, a young lawmaker stood and declared, "We no longer measure sovereignty in speeches. We measure it in harvests." His words were met not with cynicism, but with applause. Even the political opposition struggled to mount an effective critique. How could one attack a revolution that filled stomachs and restored hope? Accusations of spectacle or populism rang hollow when villagers themselves spoke of real food, real income, and real dignity. Yet alongside the triumphs lurked unspoken risks. Climate models warned of shorter rainy seasons. Agricultural experts raised concerns about over-reliance on a single crop. Expectations grew dangerously high. Once a nation learns to hope, any betrayal of that hope can ignite deeper anger than hunger itself. Still, for the moment, hope was holding. Across Burkina Faso, murals of maize stalks appeared on clinic walls, schools, and marketplaces. Radio hosts repeated the phrase, "We are no longer waiting to be fed. We are feeding ourselves." And so the revolution shifted from fields to identity. What began as helicopters scattering kernels had become a national rebirth, written in classrooms, kitchens, and village squares. If sovereignty could be measured in anything, it was not in flags or treaties, but in the quiet power of a mother grinding her own flour, of a youth who chose to stay, of a people no longer dependent but determined. But as the nation grew stronger within, storms were gathering without, because the global order was not ready to let this revolution stand unchallenged. From Washington to Brussels, from Geneva to Nairobi, the maize revolution of Burkina Faso unsettled long-standing assumptions about Africa's place in the global order. For decades, American foreign aid had followed a familiar formula. Ship grain, fund NGOs, deliver stability through assistance. Yet when helicopters rained 2,000 tons of maize without a single foreign banner in sight, the world saw something different. It was not charity, it was sovereignty. In the United States, reactions split along predictable lines. Within government, policy analysts voiced caution. They warned that Burkina Faso's bold independence might draw it closer to China or the Gulf, undermining Western influence in the Sahel. Agricultural lobbies, worried about disruptions to long-standing export markets, pressed lawmakers to protect American interests. A senator at a closed-door hearing even asked, "What happens if more African nations decide they do not need our grain?" Yet beyond the policy elite, ordinary Americans, especially older generations in the Midwest, saw something else. To them, the image of helicopters dropping seeds instead of bombs resonated deeply. Talk radio hosts praised the move as a reminder of dignity through soil, pride through work, resilience through community. For farmers who had seen their own small towns decline, the story from Africa felt strangely familiar. A bottom-up revival without foreign permission. Europe, by contrast, reacted defensively. Brussels issued new trade restrictions, citing safety protocols and certification standards, but few missed the underlying truth: protectionism. European grain lobbies, long dominant in West African markets, feared being displaced. Leaked documents from Geneva revealed coordinated efforts to block Burkina maize from entering ports under layers of technical compliance. To many Africans, it was hypocrisy exposed. When Europe sold grain, it was free trade. When Africa sold grain, it was a threat. Meanwhile, Russia entered the narrative. President Vladimir Putin positioned himself as a supporter of African sovereignty, framing his alignment with Ouagadougou as a partnership of equals. International headlines tied the story to Ibrahim Traoré and Putin, sparking speculation of a new geopolitical axis. Moscow's message was clear. If the West closed its gates, Africa had other doors to walk through. In the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE quickly secured long-term contracts, guaranteeing imports of Burkina maize. India and China expressed interest not only in raw grain, but in ethanol and value-added products. Suddenly, the so-called miracle crop was no longer a domestic achievement alone. It was a global commodity. Yet with every new contract signed, the stakes rose higher. Could Burkina Faso maintain its independence while navigating the world's competing powers? Could it build a future without becoming a pawn in larger geopolitical games? The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could feed itself, but whether the world would allow it to feed others. The maize revolution of Burkina Faso had already rewritten the script once thought immutable. That Africa must remain dependent, that sovereignty could not be sown. Yet as green fields spread across the Sahel, the future remained uncertain, and three paths emerged before the nation and the continent. The first path was triumph. In this vision, Burkina Faso would become the breadbasket of the Sahel, transforming famine into surplus. Processing plants would rise along highways, farmers' cooperatives would scale into regional enterprises, and young entrepreneurs would drive an agri-tech boom. From this future, Africa would no longer import survival, it would export prosperity. The second path was peril. Climate models warned of harsher droughts, shorter rainy seasons, and unpredictable storms. Without irrigation infrastructure and crop diversification, a single failed season could undo years of progress. Trade wars loomed as Europe erected barriers and corporations lobbied to stifle African exports. In this scenario, the maize revolution could collapse under the weight of external resistance and internal overreach. The third path lay somewhere in between. Success and setbacks interwoven, victories in local markets offset by struggles in global ones. In this mixed reality, Burkina Faso would survive, but not yet thrive, caught in the long struggle between hope and hostility. For the elders of the nation, the stakes carried a spiritual weight. Many had prayed through decades of famine, had buried children lost to hunger, had watched leaders bow before donors. To them, the message was clear. Dignity does not arrive on a relief truck. It is not written in treaties drafted abroad. It is planted in the soil, watered with resilience, harvested by one's own hands. The helicopters had not only sown maize, they had sown the belief that Africa could choose its own future. Yet the burden of belief is heavy. Once a people discover hope, betrayal of that hope carries a cost more severe than hunger itself. Traoré's government knew this. Each decision, each harvest, was more than policy. It was a promise. To the youth who chose to stay, to the women who led cooperatives, to the elders who prayed for rain, failure was not just political, it was existential. And so, the road ahead demanded courage. Could Africa rise as one, refusing to bow before foreign dictates? Could it transform not only its farms, but its political imagination? Or would the revolution of maize be remembered as a brief flame extinguished by drought and diplomacy? As the fields of Burkina Faso stretched green across the Sahel, one question remained. Was this the dawn of Africa's sovereignty, or the calm before its greatest storm? From the cracked earth of 2025 to the green fields that followed, Burkina Faso had lived through more than an agricultural experiment. It had lived through a rebirth. Helicopters that once symbolized war became the bearers of life. 2,000 tons of maize scattered from the sky did more than feed a nation. They planted a new identity. In a country long defined by dependency, hope was no longer imported. It was homegrown. This story reverberated far beyond Ouagadougou. It unsettled lobbies in Brussels, raised questions in Washington, and inspired ordinary people across the globe. Some analysts framed it in headlines of crisis, others in headlines of miracle. Either way, the world could not look away. For months, the Ibrahim Traoré news cycle carried not images of famine, but images of children running through fields, women leading cooperatives, and youth choosing to build rather than flee. Yet hope alone cannot shield against drought or diplomacy. The future will demand more than symbolism. It will demand systems, irrigation, resilience, and political courage. The shadow of the next climate disaster looms, and global markets remain hostile. But even so, the transformation has already shifted something irreversible. The people of Burkina Faso have seen what sovereignty looks like, and they will not unsee it. This is why debates around Ibrahim Traoré and Putin, Western aid, and global trade matter less than one undeniable fact. A poor nation once dismissed as fragile showed the world that dignity can sprout from soil when courage waters it. Whether governments applaud or obstruct, whether lobbies embrace or resist, the seed of independence has been planted. The true question now is not whether maize will grow, but whether Africa will continue to grow into its own power. Can a continent long told to wait finally stand on its own terms? Can food be more than survival? Can it be sovereignty? If this story stirs something in your chest, don't let it end here. Share it, speak of it, and subscribe. Because for too long, Africa's voice was muted. Together, we can ensure the world hears it, loud and unbroken. And so, as fields turn green under the Sahel sun, the last question is yours. Do you believe this revolution is the beginning of Africa's tomorrow, or just the beginning of the fight to defend it?